Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Islam in the 21st century. Now today we're discussing the issue of moderate Islam, the rise against liberalism. And before the break we were looking at the whole semantics of the issue, the use of the term, the liberals, Muslim liberals or Islamic liberals, and also moderate Islam. Now I want to turn to Asif, inshallah. Both Sayyid and Murtaza on the panel, they sort of had problems with the ideas of actually using these terms, moderate Islam and liberal Islam, because they didn't feel that they feel that it imposed itself on the discussion. But surely if you look at the reality on the ground of the situation, there is such a group of liberal, they will call themselves liberal Muslims, who have a specific set of opinions, and indeed they identify themselves as liberals. And people who identify themselves as orthodox. So, I mean, these groups certainly do exist, do they not?
Of course, yeah, they exist. And everyone, in some sense of the word, or they may, in some sense of the word, represent themselves as being the moderate Islam, the voice for Islam, those people who speak for Islam. But there are differences between the two. And in order to come to that middle path, that middle way, we sometimes have to understand the opposites. And understanding the opposites, we need to realize the difference between the so-called liberals and the so-called extremists, because the extremists of course will not call themselves extremists, but the liberals have no problem with calling themselves liberals or progressive. And one of the ways that we can identify the differences between the two is the fact that the liberals, they are preempting the results. They're looking for the spirit of the Sharia to be implemented, but they're not following its means. What I mean by this is that they are looking for a certain result. So example, the result may be harmony or having social cohesion or so on and so forth. But the way that they get to those results is a way other than Islam, or a way that is seemingly other than Islam. So they will bring in odd opinions, they'll bring in strange opinions, something which is not from the mainstream understanding of Islam. So this is a lack of reliance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, lack of tawakkul in Allah, dependence upon Him, and also it's bypassing the wisdom of the Sharia, because what they're effectively saying is that the Sharia cannot be implemented, it cannot be lived. And one of the reasons why they do this is because, and this is at odds with the extremists, is that they are thinking too much about what other people have to say about Islam. Whilst the extremists, they fall into the other trap where they don't care what other people think about Islam. And so this
again, you're labeling these quote-unquote extremists as the moderate Muslims, really, because they are following the Quran and Sunnah?
No, what I mean by this are those who are are not the ones who are moderate Islam. Because a moderate Islam, it takes into account both of these elements.
Okay.
There are things that we have to not care what other people what other religions and other faiths think about Islam. Islam in its pristine form is something which is the truth, and we shouldn't hide or shun away the truth. But at the same time, there are aspects in which we do have to take into consideration what other people think, and this is the mechanism or the processes in the way it's being conveyed.
But you see that here, this is precisely one of the problems, if you like, in the debate, which is that any discussion of extreme, moderate, or otherwise liberal, the other end, imagines static entities. The only way in which you can talk about the moderate as bringing together both is by talking about context over and over again, i.e. that in some contexts they don't pay heed to what others may be saying or are thinking, but in other contexts they do pay attention to how this may be coming across. If I've understood you correctly, Asif.
That would be another difference between the so-called extremists and the liberals, because the liberal element only live within the time.
No, but the thing is, what's happening here is the moderate are being privileged by not being static, while the extremists and the liberals are being held in this discourse, in this rhetoric of ours, as static entities. It's only in this abstracted sort of static form that we can really have this discussion, and I think that speaks to its falsity. because we're talking about liberals and extremists as static and the moderates as contextually bound. When I think everyone is contextually bound, I think there are times when the moderate would seem extreme to someone, and at other times the same person or the same moderate would seem liberal from another perspective. I think this discussion gets short-circuited precisely at this point, when what we're discussing is much more complicated than the terminology available to us would allow us to discuss with.
But do you not think that the modernists are? You're saying that they're all contextualizing Islam, but I feel that the extremists are probably not contextualizing Islam, and also the liberals, they're not static. They're constantly changing their understanding of Islam to meet the what other people have to say about Islam.
If I've understood you, Asif, what I'm trying to suggest is that our rhetoric about extreme, moderate and liberal is the idea that the liberal and the extremists are held in a static position. The extremists are those, according to your earlier statement, who pay no heed to what others think. The liberals on this side pay perhaps too much heed to what others think. This middle group, this privileged group that we're calling moderate, bring both. This is Ahl Sunnah, we say.
Sure.
But you see that this rhetoric is constructing this spectrum. Does this spectrum actually exist? Because the moderates are privileged with being aware of context, while these two groups of people, be they whatever they are not. We're not allowing them to be contextual. My proposition is that actually everyone is contextual. Everyone responds to the context in which they live. They don't respond by saying, I'm an extremist, therefore my response is simply this. I'm a liberal, therefore my response is only this. And the reason and the truth of this, I think, is manifested when we find sometimes liberals come across very extreme. This irony that someone who supposedly stands on this side and is a liberal, so endowed with qualities of flexibility and greater awareness of this, that and the other, actually on the hijab issue, for example, will come across becoming very sort of extreme because they're inflexible. And how does this occur? Well, because they were never static to begin with. They were never merely endowed with sort of flexibility and all these positive associations that the word liberal carries. They were never that. They were simply human beings who are always responding to context. I think the terminology is thrust upon us from the outside. And what we need to say is this terminology doesn't help to the government and to others. This terminology has no value.
I'll surely say then, Asif, in Islamic history there are certain schools that have arrived in the Muslim Ummah that propose different types of versions, if you want to call it, of Islam that can be seen as more liberal and more extreme or more orthodox in their opinion. So we have inevitably to refer to these terms, do we not?
I mean, this term of liberalism is possibly a product of Western thinking, and it's been and this has somewhat influenced our discourse that we're having today, because in Islam, classically speaking, there was only moderate Islam, inverted commas, and there was extremism. So the liberals would actually be considered to be extreme because they're transgressing the boundaries of the Sharia and boundaries of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us and is pleased with. So again, this is a whole very semantical discussion that we're having here with respect to the trends that each of these types of groups are going to. And the problem, as Said correctly said, is that when we are discussing such terms, we are inadvertently pigeonholing a whole school of thought, and people do not work like that. So, people are far more complex.
Is then the answer then, Murtaza, then just to say moderate Islam or the Islam is the Orthodox Islam, or the Islam that refers to just the Quran and Sunnah and take it from there? It's certainly something that Muhammad Nizami refers to in his article, is that there is no other way to derive our Islam but through these textual evidence.
If you want me to give a very personal, emotional response, my answer is I don't like these terms, I don't want to use them. But as we've already discussed, the reality is that they exist and these labels exist. So going back to the article, I think we must not try to define something anew which has already been created with a purpose in mind. And we have to acknowledge who created it, who made these labels. It wasn't Muslims. That's the least we can say, that this definition came from without. And with that comes the realization that in discourse, in public discourse, in the media, it's used with a certain meaning. So no matter how long we sit here and try to define it as we want, it has a certain widely held,
it's loaded, yeah.
Meaning, which is contrary to what we are talking about today. So what we come to, the realistic, the pragmatic solution to this issue is that how do we move from, as underdogs, how do we move the definition from what it is widely held to be to what we want it to be? And in doing so, you have to understand that the ones we're describing as liberal, those are the ones that are described as moderate. And that's the issue we have to wrangle with. And we have to let the people who have labeled us thus, the media and the government, we have to send them the message that this is counterproductive. This is counterproductive to their own aims. Because to classify what we term as liberal as moderate, what they're doing is they're giving credence to the minority. Yes, and therefore they are lessening their own impact, their own influence, their own relationship with the Muslim community. Because they should label the ones moderate who represent the mainstream. And it's all, upside down, and it's counterproductive. So I think what we should be discussing, maybe that's how we can, maybe it's an open question, is not what we want to define it as, not what we think it is, not that we don't want it to exist, but how do we move? How do we move from that?
And I guess one of the things, and we will be discussing after the break, which is coming up, is the agendas as to why these terms are being used.
And we must realize, we cannot have these discussions in a vacuum. We must realize that we're the underdogs. Yeah, when we create a term, and we in terms of power, we're such underdogs that even terminology and words that are our own, that are from our own tradition, which are from our own religion, have even been hijacked and manipulated, like jihad, like Islamist. I mean, what does that mean? Islamist. What's the difference between Islamist and a Muslim, linguistically speaking? These are terms which have been created for the specific purpose. They're not objective or impartial words.
Jazakumullah khair. I'm getting a very renewed sense for the power of words here, inshallah. Do join us after the break for more discussion on these issues, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.